Hello and welcome. Today we're exploring the untold history of Pepsi, the drink nobody wanted. Join me on this journey into the past.
In 1990, an American soft drink company received 17 submarines from the Soviet Union. Not blueprints, not scrap metal on paper, actual diesel submarines moored at naval bases in northern Soviet territory. The deal also included a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. The Soviet Union had no hard currency to pay for shipments of Pepsi syrup. The ruble was virtually worthless outside the country, and instead of money, the Soviet side offered what it had in abundance: warships. The company's chairman called the White House and told the National Security Advisor, "We're disarming the Soviets faster than you are." That phone call gave rise to the enduring legend that for a few weeks, a soft drink company possessed the sixth largest navy in the world. Historians have been quick to dismiss that claim, and rightly so. The submarines were old, decommissioned vessels that were almost immediately sold to a Swedish company for scrap. But the ships were real. The transaction was real. The documents still exist in the archives. The company was Pepsi. And what makes that scene truly remarkable is this. 70 years earlier, the very same company had gone bankrupt. Then it went bankrupt a second time. Its founder died as a pharmacist in a small southern town after losing virtually everything he owned. The man who later bought what remained of the business approached Coca-Cola and offered to sell them the entire formula. Coca-Cola refused, not once, but 3 separate times. By the end of the 20th century, that rejected formula employed more than 200,000 people, negotiated with Soviet general secretaries, set Michael Jackson's hair on fire during a live commercial shoot, and became the catalyst for street riots that claimed lives. This is the story of 1990. But it begins in 1893 in the pharmacy of a town with barely 7,000 residents, where a young pharmacist was mixing a remedy for indigestion with no idea what he was about to set in motion. New Bern, North Carolina, a small port town on the swampy Atlantic coast, hot, humid, and thick with mosquitoes. Caleb Bradham studied medicine at the University of Maryland, but his family ran out of money before he could finish. He returned home and opened a pharmacy on the corner of Middle Street and Pollock Street. Like most pharmacies of the time, his store featured a soda fountain. It was not simply a place to sell soft drinks, it was part of the medical practice of the era. Carbonated water was widely believed to aid digestion, and pharmacists mixed it with their own proprietary syrups. Every druggist had a formula of his own. Bradham combined sugar, vanilla, flavoring oils, and cola nut. The result was a drink that, according to his own calculations, was supposed to help relieve dyspepsia, indigestion. Local customers simply called it Brad's drink. It became so popular that in 1898, Bradham gave it a proper name, Pepsi-Cola. The name came from dyspepsia and the cola nut. It is worth pausing here for a moment. Coca-Cola had been created in Atlanta in 1886, 7 years earlier, in almost exactly the same way: a pharmacist, a soda fountain, and a homemade syrup. America in the 1990s was filled with hundreds of drinks just like these. Almost all of them disappeared. The difference between the brands that survived and those that vanished was rarely the recipe itself. By 1903, Bradham had registered the trademark and left the pharmacy business behind. By 1910, Pepsi had more than 250 bottling franchises across 24 states. The company advertised in newspapers, hired race car driver Barney Oldfield to promote the drink, and sold its syrup by the barrel. By 1915, Bradham had built a 3-story factory, purchased a house overlooking the Neuse River, and become one of the most prominent men in the county. He served as president of the local bank, commanded a company in the National Guard, and was seriously considering a run for the state Senate. The man who 20 years earlier could not afford to complete medical school had become one of the wealthiest citizens of North Carolina. For 2 decades, everything moved in only one direction, upward. Then, Bradham made a single mistake, and it cost him everything.
The First World War reshaped the global sugar market. Europe's sugar beet fields had been devastated, supply chains had collapsed, and the U.S. government imposed sugar rationing. For a business built on little more than sugar and water, that was an existential threat. When those restrictions were lifted in 1919, sugar prices began to soar. 12 cents a pound, 18. By the summer of 1920, sugar was selling for more than 20 cents per pound, and almost everyone in the industry believed the price would keep climbing. Caleb Bradham believed it too. He borrowed heavily and bought enormous quantities of sugar in advance, determined to secure his supply before prices rose even higher. The logic was perfectly reasonable. Many manufacturers were doing exactly the same thing. Then, within months, the market collapsed. By December 1920, sugar had fallen below 4 cents per pound, and by 1921, it had dropped even further. Bradham found himself sitting on warehouses full of sugar that he had purchased for 5, 6, even 7 times the current market price. He tried to wait for a recovery. It never came.
In 1923, Pepsi-Cola declared bankruptcy. Its assets were auctioned off. Bradham returned to the counter of his pharmacy in New Bern, where he worked until his death in 1934. The man who had invented one of the world's most recognizable beverages died with no connection to the company he had created. The trademark was purchased by New York stockbroker Roy Megargel. He invested his own money, attempted to relaunch the business, and struggled for 8 years to keep it alive. In 1931, Pepsi went bankrupt for the second time. 38 years of existence, 2 bankruptcies, not a single sign of the global company it would one day become.
And this is the moment the people in Atlanta would probably rather forget. At different points in its history, Pepsi's owners approached Coca-Cola with essentially the same offer. Take the brand, take the formula, name your price. According to various historical accounts, this happened 3 times, first in the early 20s and then again in the early 30s. Historians still debate the exact details because the surviving documentation is incomplete, but one fact is supported by evidence from both sides. Coca-Cola said no, every single time. To be fair, I don't think that decision was foolish. In 1931, Coca-Cola dominated the soft drink market almost completely, while Pepsi was a brand that had gone bankrupt twice, with no meaningful manufacturing network, no distribution system, and very few customers. Buying it would have been like purchasing the sign from a burned-down store. Coca-Cola's mistake was not how it evaluated Pepsi. Its mistake was assuming the market would always remain the way it was. Within 3 years, it no longer did.
The brand was eventually picked up by Charles Guth, a hard-nosed businessman who owned the Loft chain of candy stores. Each of his stores had a soda fountain, and for years he had purchased Coca-Cola syrup. Guth asked the company in Atlanta for a wholesale discount that matched the size of his business. They refused. He took it personally. Instead of accepting the decision, Guth did something no one expected. He bought the bankrupt Pepsi brand and removed Coca-Cola from every Loft store, replacing it with his own drink. The first year was a disaster. Customers ordered Coca-Cola, received Pepsi instead, and complained. Then, in the middle of the Great Depression, Guth came up with an idea that changed everything. Coca-Cola was sold in a 6.5-ounce bottle for 5 cents. Guth discovered a plentiful supply of inexpensive 12-ounce beer bottles left over after Prohibition ended, and began bottling Pepsi in them. The price stayed exactly the same, 5 cents, twice as much drink for the same money. In 1934, roughly 15 million Americans were unemployed. Every penny mattered. The promise of the same price, twice the amount, spoke directly to the economic reality of the era. Sales began to climb, and they never stopped. In 1939, Pepsi launched the radio jingle, "Nickel Nickel." 12 full ounces, that's a lot, twice as much for a nickel, too. Set to the melody of an old English hunting song, it was broadcast nationwide, translated into dozens of languages, and sung by ordinary Americans in the streets. It became the first advertising jingle in history to achieve nationwide popularity. Coca-Cola had no easy response. It had millions of bottles of a fixed size, vending machines built for that exact format, and contracts with bottlers across the country. Changing course would have required rebuilding the entire system. Pepsi had found the one place where its giant rival was trapped by the very scale of its own success. In 1938, Walter Mack became president of Pepsi. He also emerged victorious in the lengthy legal battle with Charles Guth, a case still studied in law schools today as Guth v. Loft. Mack looked at the company's sales map and noticed something the rest of the soft drink industry had largely chosen to ignore. More than 13 million Black Americans were buying soft drinks, yet no major beverage company was speaking to them directly. Advertisements featured only white families. In Coca-Cola's marketing, Black Americans appeared almost exclusively as servants or background figures. In 1947, Mack hired Edward F. Boyd and asked him to build an all-black sales team. Boyd assembled a group of 12 sales representatives who traveled across the country, working with neighborhood stores, churches, schools, and local newspapers. He also commissioned a series of advertisements portraying Black families as ordinary middle-class consumers, not servants, not stereotypes, simply customers. They were operating in a segregated America. The team could not stay in most hotels or eat in most restaurants along their routes. In many southern cities, they were met with threats. Even within Pepsi, some executives opposed the campaign, and several bottlers openly refused to distribute the new advertising. Despite all of that, Pepsi's sales among Black consumers rose dramatically. When Walter Mack left the company, the program gradually lost support. Boyd himself was pushed out in the early 1950s. There is one point I think is important to make plainly. Pepsi did not launch this campaign out of moral idealism. It was a calculated business decision by the number 2 company in the market, looking for customers its dominant rival had neglected. But the outcome does not depend on the motive. It became the first major national advertising campaign in the United States to portray Black Americans as ordinary people rather than as props or caricatures. Sometimes the right thing happens for the wrong reasons. In the summer of 1959, the American National Exhibition opened in Sokolniki Park. It was designed as a showcase of American capitalism in the heart of the Soviet Union. Automobiles, washing machines, and even a full-scale model of a typical American suburban home cut open to reveal its interior. Donald Kendall, then head of Pepsi's international division, set up a Pepsi stand at the exhibition. The company's leadership opposed the trip. Kendall went anyway. The day before the exhibition opened, he caught up with U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon and asked for a single favor: bring Nikita Khrushchev to the Pepsi stand. The following day, Nixon and Khrushchev toured the exhibition together. They argued over kitchen appliances, consumer goods, and standards of living in what would later become famous as the kitchen debate. Then Nixon led Khrushchev to the Pepsi booth. The photograph spread around the world, the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union standing with a paper cup of Pepsi in his hand. According to the popular story, he drank several cups in succession. No advertising campaign could have bought publicity like that. Kendall became president of PepsiCo in 1963 and spent the next 13 years negotiating with Soviet officials. In 1972, he achieved something no other American consumer brand had managed. Pepsi received the exclusive right to sell its soft drinks in the Soviet Union. Coca-Cola was not allowed into the country. The Soviet Union, however, had a problem. It had nothing with which to pay. The ruble was not convertible, and the Soviet government was unwilling to spend scarce hard currency. The two sides eventually agreed on a barter arrangement. Pepsi would supply its syrup concentrate, while in return it would receive the exclusive rights to import Stolichnaya vodka into the United States. Soft drinks in exchange for vodka. For 15 years, the arrangement worked remarkably well. It began to unravel in the late 1980s, when American consumers increasingly boycotted Soviet products following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and sales of Stolichnaya declined sharply. A new commodity was needed to keep the barter system alive. That is how, in 1990, a contract worth more than $3 billion came to include 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer, all of which Pepsi promptly resold for scrap metal. 1 year later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. With it disappeared the entire trading system that had made the deal possible. Its assets were suddenly scattered across 15 newly independent states. While Pepsi struggled to untangle the collapse, Coca-Cola finally entered the Russian market and, within just a few years, overtook the rival that had spent 2 decades building it. In 1975, Pepsi launched an advertising campaign built around what looked like a simple experiment. A small table would be set up in a shopping mall where 2 identical, unmarked cups, one filled with Pepsi and the other with Coca-Cola, were offered to passing shoppers. They were asked one simple question: which one tastes better? Everything was filmed. Most people chose Pepsi. Those commercials aired on national television for years. The campaign was both honest and brilliantly clever. Pepsi is sweeter and delivers a stronger first impression, while participants in the challenge took only a single sip. Over the course of an entire bottle, many people might have reached a different conclusion, but the audience never saw that. Executives in Atlanta panicked. Coca-Cola's own internal taste tests confirmed the same uncomfortable result. And on April 23, 1985, the company made a decision that is still studied today as one of the greatest marketing failures in business history. It changed the formula of a drink that had remained essentially unchanged for 99 years. New Coke was sweeter. In blind taste tests, it outperformed both Pepsi and the original Coca-Cola. America exploded. Coca-Cola's headquarters received as many as 1,500 phone calls a day. Customers bought cases of the original Coke and stored them in their garages. In Seattle, a group was formed to defend the original formula. Pepsi declared a company holiday for its employees and released advertisements celebrating what it called a victory. 79 days later, Coca-Cola brought back the original formula under the name Coca-Cola Classic. Sales immediately climbed. And that brings us to my favorite paradox in this entire story. Pepsi won the taste war and lost the market war. By forcing its rival into one of the biggest mistakes in corporate history, it reminded millions of Americans just how much they loved Coca-Cola. Sometimes, the most successful blow you land against a competitor ends up making that competitor even stronger. Now comes the darkest chapter of the story. In February 1992, Pepsi launched a promotion in the Philippines called Number Fever. 3-digit numbers were printed under bottle caps, and every day a winning number was announced on national television. The grand prize was 1 million pesos, about $40,000, at a time when the average annual income was roughly $1,000. The country went crazy. People bought soft drinks by the case, collected bottle caps, and even slept with them under their pillows. Small shopkeepers took out loans to buy more inventory, while some families sold livestock and motorcycles to purchase additional bottles. By Pepsi's own estimates, nearly half of the country's adult population, around 26 million people, took part in the promotion. Pepsi's market share jumped from 4% to almost 25%. The company extended the campaign by another 5 weeks because no one wanted to stop something that successful. Then came May 25th. The winning number announced on television was 349. The problem was that the number 349 had not been printed on just a handful of bottle caps. It had been printed on approximately 800,000 of them. The mistake was caused by a failure in the validation system. The number was supposed to belong to the non-winning list, but its security code was not properly checked before production. Had Pepsi honored every winning cap, the company would have faced obligations of roughly $32 billion. It simply did not have that kind of money. The next morning, crowds gathered outside Pepsi factories holding bottle caps marked 349. The company announced that only caps bearing the correct security code were valid winners, and almost none of the caps in people's hands contained that code. Technically, the company was following the official rules of the promotion, but for someone who had watched their number appear on national television and had already imagined buying a house or paying for their children's education, it felt like a betrayal.
Riots broke out. Crowds hurled stones at Pepsi factories and offices. Pepsi trucks were overturned and set on fire in the streets. In February 1993, a grenade was thrown at one of the company's delivery trucks in Manila. A school teacher and a 5-year-old girl were killed, and several other people were injured. By the end of the conflict, according to various estimates, around 5 people had lost their lives, dozens had been wounded, and more than 30 vehicles had been destroyed. Pepsi offered affected participants 500 pesos as a gesture of goodwill, about $18 at the time. Nearly 500,000 people accepted the payment, costing the company roughly $10 million. Thousands of civil lawsuits and dozens of criminal complaints were filed against Pepsi. The legal battle lasted for more than 15 years, and in the end, the Philippine courts ruled in the company's favor, concluding that the incident had been a technical error rather than an act of deliberate fraud. Legally, Pepsi was in the right. But I'll be honest, what stays with me is not the printing error itself, it's the $18. A company worth billions decided that $18 was an appropriate response to people who had watched national television promise them what amounted to roughly 20 years of income. In my view, it was that number, not the software failure, that transformed a technical mistake into an event the Philippines still remembers today. There are 2 more stories from the 1990s that are worth knowing about Pepsi. On January 27, 1984, during the filming of a Pepsi commercial at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, the pyrotechnics were triggered too early, and Michael Jackson's hair caught fire. He suffered 2nd and 3rd degree burns. As part of the legal settlement, Jackson received $1.5 million, which he donated to the burn center at Brotman Medical Center. The facility was later renamed in his honor. Many of Jackson's biographers believe that the pain medication prescribed after this accident marked the beginning of the dependency that would follow him for the rest of his life. In 1996, Pepsi launched its Pepsi Stuff promotion. As a joke, one commercial claimed that 7 million Pepsi points could be redeemed for a Harrier jump jet. A college student named John Wennard noticed that additional points could legally be purchased with cash. He raised $700,000 from investors and mailed Pepsi a check requesting the aircraft. Pepsi refused. Leonard sued.
In 1999, Judge Kimba Wood ruled that no reasonable person would interpret the commercial as a genuine contractual offer, and the case was dismissed. The decision is still cited today in contract law textbooks. Today, the numbers look very different. PepsiCo generates roughly $92 billion in annual revenue and employs around 300,000 people worldwide. By revenue, the company is nearly twice the size of Coca-Cola. The reason is simple. Pepsi stopped being just a soft drink company a long time ago. Its 1965 merger with Frito-Lay brought brands such as Lay's, Doritos, and Cheetos into the business. Later came Quaker Oats, Tropicana, and Gatorade. Today, the company's largest profits come not from beverages, but from snack foods. Pepsi never truly won the battle for the soda fountain. It simply left the soda fountain behind and conquered a different aisle of the supermarket.
In 1996, Russian cosmonauts aboard the Mir space station performed a spacewalk carrying a mock-up of a Pepsi can nearly the size of a human being as part of an advertising campaign. Pepsi reportedly paid around $5 million for the promotion. Just take a moment to think about what was orbiting the Earth that day. A remedy for indigestion invented by a medical student who never finished medical school, working in the pharmacy of a town with barely 7,000 residents. A business that went bankrupt and then went bankrupt again. A brand that Coca-Cola refused to buy 3 separate times, even at a bargain price. A drink that survived only because someone found a supply of cheap beer bottles after Prohibition.
That little syrup outlived the Great Depression, built its business in segregated America, persuaded Nikita Khrushchev to stand in front of the cameras with a paper cup in his hand, accepted military submarines as payment, pushed its biggest rival into one of the most expensive marketing mistakes in history, accidentally set Michael Jackson's hair on fire, sparked riots on the other side of the world, and ultimately made its way into orbit. Not bad for a syrup that was originally meant to soothe an upset stomach. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and let me know one thing in the comments. Where do you think the real turning point in this story happened? Was it Charles Guth's decision to use those oversized beer bottles? Or was it the photograph of Khrushchev holding a paper cup of Pepsi? I'm genuinely curious which one you'll choose, because my own answer changed while I was researching this video.